I never found my people, I never found my place. And finally, I landed and I found my friends. And being here in Israel is just a life-changing experience to finally land where I was supposed to be always.
The people, the experiences, and just like the joy that we had on this trip, I'm gonna cry. It's like I've never had such a meaningful yet fun experience in my entire life ever.
Founded in 1994 by Charles Bronfman and Michael Steinhardt in cooperation with the Israeli government, Birthright Israel, or simply Birthright, is a free 10-day heritage trip to Israel, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights for young adults of Jewish heritage between the ages of 18 and 26. The purpose being to strengthen diaspora Jews' connection to Israel and increase a sense of Jewish identity. But can a free trip really be free?
A 10-day trip to Israel with flights, food, and a ton of Instagrammable moments, all for free? You may have heard of Birthright Israel, the all-expense-paid adventure to the Holy Land. Seems too good to be true, right? There has to be a catch. But there isn't one. You're not going to be roped into long, boring religious seminars or be told what to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And If Not Now is targeting Birthright in a campaign urging the group to, in its words, tell the truth about the Israeli occupation.
Not to learn about Israel, you came to learn about Palestine. This is my country. I'm a Jew. This is my country, and I'm not living anywhere. No Palestinian is going to send me away from here.
They specifically banned trip organizers from planning trips that involve meeting with Israeli Arabs.
There's a group of us on this trip. We've been asking questions and trying to engage, and we have not been able to do that. And as a result, the 5 of us will be leaving.
Birthright and what it does by refusing to discuss, show the occupation, or even allow us to hear from Palestinians, what it's really doing is hiding the occupation from young American Jews like myself.
Birthright is funded in large part by the Israeli government, along with support from influential donors like the Adelson, Blavatnik, and Kraft families of the world. And with such significant backing from Israel and organizations known for their deep ties to Zionism, one has to wonder whether the experiences of young Jewish adults on Birthright trips are shaped more by the vision of these benefactors than by a neutral exploration of Israel and of the Jewish heritage and identity.
So Birthright in name alone is fucked. Like, it's really problematic, right? Because what it's essentially saying is that these diaspora Jewish youth who have never been to Israel, who may have no family in Israel, have no genetic or ancestral ties to Israel, can decide to go on a trip that says this place is your right by birth. You deserve to be here. You are welcome back. Meanwhile, Palestinians who have been displaced from the land that is currently occupied have no right of return.
Joining us today to provide her insights and perspectives about Birthright is Katie Bogan. She is a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Nebraska and a prominent voice in the anti-Zionist Jewish community. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
All right, so I think the first place that I want to start is maybe your upbringing as it relates to Judaism, Zionism. How were you raised? What ideas, values, beliefs did your parents try to instill in you, just as a baseline?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. My grandfather Stosh and his sisters Helen and Bella survived the Holocaust, but they were the only 3 people in their family to do so. And they were liberated in 1945 and then spent several years in Germany before migrating to the United States in 1949. And so even during that migration process, my grandfather and Helen were given the option to settle either in the United States or to receive a plot of land and a stipend and move to Israel. And they chose the United States because they had community already here. So it is sort of by the flip of a coin and by a decision made, in 1949 that I am here instead of in Israel. And when I was growing up, my family is an incredibly Zionist family. They really imagined the state of Israel as this land that offered salvation to my grandfather and his siblings after a deep, immense trauma. And so I grew up hearing, as many Jewish youth do in the United States, at every Passover Seder, next year in Israel, that really strengthened my tie to this imagined savior space of Israel, this glittering land where I would never have to face any anti-Semitism. So Israel existed to me absent the construct of Palestine until I was about 18. And that is when my Zionist unlearning process began, and I started to build my more liberatory pro-Palestine politic.
So that leads to my next question, which is, what did you know about Israel, about Palestine prior to going on Birthright? It sounds like you did some exploration beforehand.
Oh, absolutely. I had friends and family who had begun going on Birthright when I was about 16 or 17. And then I started college and learned about Palestine as an occupied land and an occupied state. And I started asking the question to folks who were returning from Birthright, what did you learn about Palestine while you were there? And I remember one of my close loved ones, who I know is sort of a solid progressive, came home and said, "Oh, do you mean the terrorists?" And that gave me such pause. I had never heard her use language like that before. And I said, no, that's certainly not what I meant. So before I went on Birthright, I wanted to make sure that I had a solid foundational working knowledge, at least of the region. And I also wanted that learning to be balanced. So I took 4 different courses on relevant topics: suffering and evil in the Jewish experience, Jewish tradition, Middle East politics, and Arab-Israeli conflict. And these were 4 university level courses. And I was also studying to get a BA in political science with a focus on comparative politics. So I took other coursework on apartheid systems and heard, the comparisons between Israel and South Africa. And so by the time I finished my college coursework and was prepared to go on Birthright, I already was staunchly pro-Palestine. I had been in the human rights literature, in the genocide and apartheid literature enough to know where my values stood on this topic. So I went on Birthright very prepared to rabble-rouse, and rouse-rabble I did.
Right. Well, so what was your experience like? What did you see there? What conversations were had? I have seen some reports, testimonies of people who spoke out against their trip leaders, and sometimes they were dismissed, kicked off the trip. So what did you do to try to challenge the endorsed narrative on your trip? It sounds like that's something that you did.
Yes, I tried to approach with a lot of pointed curiosity. My tour guide was a veteran of the Second Lebanon War, and claimed objectivity. And his name was Ayal, and he would always talk about how he was sort of an objective commentator on the politics between Israel and Palestine. And so I would ask, how does your role as a veteran impact that objectivity? Can you talk about the water crisis? Why is it that Israel has this world-famous desalination technology and can access clean water, and they're not sharing that technology with Gaza, who's isolated on this strip? Can you talk about settlements? How are Israelis justifying settlements in the West Bank when Palestinians live on so little land? And then even when we were on this trip, there were these kind of sleight of hand distraction tactics where we'd be on the bus and they would say, if you look out the right side of the bus, you'll see these beautiful groves and orchards. And I would immediately go to the left side of the bus and see what they didn't want us to acknowledge. And those were essentially the shanty towns that Arab Israelis were forced to live in, these really impoverished regions that they just didn't want us to recognize because it was a visual representation of the inequity that is worked into Israeli society and sort of the way they treat Arab Israelis or non-Jewish Israelis.
I'm curious, when you did bring some of these things up to the trip leaders, what would they say?
I got a similar, oh, you mean the terrorists, or oh, Hamas response. And that's, I think, something that actually made me quite angry and frustrated when I was on the trip. And I said to Ayal in front of some other people, you have a group of impressionable young adults, 18 to 26-year-old adults, who are hearing you repeatedly make the comparison between Palestinian civilians and terrorists, Palestinian civilians and Hamas, which is one small representative group, not the whole of Palestine. And he would sort of get defensive and try to pivot or talk about something else and sort of wave me away as a rabble-rouser, and tried to speak to me on the trip one-on-one several times about sort of where I had learned the information that I was sharing with other students. And I talked about my coursework with him. And afterwards, he reached out to me trying to encourage me to make Aliyah and to become an Israeli citizen. It's like, you're a critical thinker. You clearly care very much about politics. Essentially, we could use you. Come join us. And all of this more political discourse isn't even getting at the subtle eugenics and military mission, it seems to me, of birthright trips. When we go on these trips, there are a group of Israeli soldiers who join us. They pick like the sexiest, most alluring, like young, hot soldiers to come on this trip with you, and then wind up having these machinations so that these Jewish diaspora youth can spend time alone with these sexy Israeli soldiers. And they'll say, you know, maybe you all will fall in love on this trip. Maybe you'll meet your soulmate. And I remember even on the trip that I attended, there were two Israeli soldiers who clearly were into each other. Like they very much had a vibe. And someone made a joke on the trip, one of their fellow soldiers saying, you have to save yourselves for the Americans, basically clarifying that they were there to seduce us, not only, you know, literally, physically, emotionally, but seduce us into kind of the sexy, glittering promise of the state of Israel and of Zionism.
Okay, I haven't heard of that situation. It didn't come up in the research I did or in the promo video for Birthright. So you're saying part of the mission, because one of the questions I was going to ask is, Birthright is in part funded by Israel, but it's also in large part funded by these Zionist organizations and wealthy families in the US. So part of, like, what do you think the true objectives are of the people who fund this trip? What are they trying to accomplish in addition to maybe what you alluded to, which is making or encouraging Americans to move to Israel?
Yeah, well, I think some of the goals of the trip are revealed by the age limits. The lower age limit for attending is 18, and the upper age limit is 26. These are people who are likely reproductively viable, who would have plenty of time to fall in love with an Israeli, get married, and have babies, who are likely of an age bracket where they are able to commit to conscripted service and will be able to serve with their bodies for the Israeli occupation force. I will not call it the IDF. I'm sorry, I can't do that. And I really think if this were about sharing Jewish culture and just having people make aliyah and building the population of Israel, there wouldn't be the stringent age limit that there is. And there's a limit for going on Birthright if you've been to Israel before for any longer than 3 months. So not only do they want these young people to go who could get married and make Jewish babies, or who could, you know, provide service to the IOF, but they want folks to not have a significant background on the state of Israel or to have spent much time there before they attend, which I think also speaks to the potential brainwashing, like the socialization effort that is being made by these Zionist organizations and funders.
Yeah, that's disturbing to hear. And I want to try to give a balanced perspective. Were there positive parts of the trip?
Absolutely. I think in terms of connecting me to my faith as a Jewish person and to my religion as a Jewish person, it was stunning. My father is a single father. My mom is Irish Catholic, but my dad is Jewish. And my dad raised me as Jewish from being a small child. But because I grew up in a Hasidic Chabad and my lineage, my Jewish lineage is patrilineal, I wasn't able to convert. And the Chabad was fairly conservative in terms of its gender politics and didn't feel like a good match for me. So I didn't have a bat mitzvah when I was growing up. And when I was on Birthright, they provided everyone on the trip the opportunity to have a b'nai mitzvah. So I wound up being bat mitzvahed at the wall in Jerusalem, having this beautiful spiritual experience and crying with other folks who were making their conversion process more official. And that was a profound, heady experience of just this is my transition to Jewish adulthood. And now I have committed to being a Jewish woman for my life.
Yeah, I think this is really important to discuss. And I do want to touch, I know we've touched on it lightly, anti-Semitism that you brought up, because I think it is a very real thing, not only in the US, but all over the world. Although I do think there is a little bit of danger in that term is being thrown around, I think, a little too haphazardly right now to mean much. If anything, it's in danger of kind of just meaning nothing. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what your personal, I know you touched on it when you were a kid, but what has been your personal experience with anti-Semitism, and what do you think should actually be done to combat it?
Yeah. Well, one example is when I was living in Rhode Island, I spent a lot of time as a grassroots organizer with the group Never Again Action, which is a Jewish youth group, community organizing group meant to prevent any kind of identity-based violence. And so I was protesting ICE detention facilities in Rhode Island. I was at counter protests against the Proud Boys when they came to Rhode Island. And the starkest experience of anti-Semitism I ever had was members of the Proud Boys sharing my contact information on Stormfront, the White Pride Worldwide website, and doxing me. So they called my cell phone and told me that they were going to come to my home. They had my home address. I had to, contact police and have a patrol car on my street for several days because the threats were legitimate and threats to safety. And I think there's a conflation happening here between the violence of language and actual threats to safety. I don't believe that the statement from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is inherently violent. That to me implies a right of return, full humanity and enfranchisement as political actors for Palestinians who choose to return to their homeland, a secular state where folks can exist with equal rights regardless of their religion and regardless of their ethnic background, and a deconstruction of ethno-nationalism in Israel-Palestine. That to me is a beautiful mission. It is not a threat of violence.
Yeah, before we go, I want to try to do maybe a little thought experiment. If you could try to strawman for us the Israeli perspective. Specifically, I know that you're a huge advocate for the LGBTQ community. So one of the arguments that I've heard a lot is they, meaning Hamas, or you could argue Palestine or the Arab world in general, they're religious extremists. Israel, we're the ones that want peace, but every time we've offered peace, they refuse. We are the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. If you, as a queer person, try to go to Gaza, or what was, I guess, once Gaza, you'd be persecuted. So despite all of these civilian deaths, you'd be a fool not to support Israel. What are your thoughts about this particular argument? Is there a case to be made here?
No. I think the argument is absurd. So first of all, that wholesale erases the safe existence of queer Palestinians and queer Gazans. There are absolutely Palestinian organizers who are queer and who are advocating for the liberation of queer community. And if you are in a position where you are being mass murdered, where you are being exterminated, and you are fighting for your life, what space do you have, cognitively, emotionally, or literally, to advocate for queer liberation? I also think Israel is not a liberal democracy. It's an ethno-nationalist state. There are citizens there who do not have the same rights because of their race, ethnicity, and the way that they're born. There have been eugenics efforts in Israel to stop, for example, Ethiopian Jews from reproducing, and this was admitted by the Israeli Minister of Health in 2014. Any of those behaviors stop Israel from really being considered a legitimate liberal democracy. And I do think this concern of if we allow Palestinians the right of return, or if we come to the table and try to negotiate, they're going to want to wipe all of us out. That is projection, because we did that. Because Jews and Zionists and Israelis came to Palestine and exiled 700,000 people and have slowly been enacting violence. And we are worried about retribution. People are concerned that they will do to us what we did to them. There's been this sort of post-Holocaust embodied violence of do unto others what has been done to you. And that, I think, really takes Israel off the table as a liberal democracy, and this argument that Palestine is the aggressor off the table as well.
That's I think, a compelling argument. And I just want to thank you for sharing your perspective. I learned a lot in this short conversation. So for those who want or are interested in hearing more of your perspective, where can people find you?
Yes, absolutely. So I am on Instagram at k.w.bogan, just first initial, middle initial, last name. And I'm on TikTok as @sexualityscholar. My academic research is on sexual functioning outcomes among survivors of sexual abuse and trauma. So if you're interested in my work there, I would say follow me on Sexuality Scholar, but I talk about my pro-Palestine politic and being sort of Zionist critical on both platforms.
All right, everybody go follow Katie. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspectives with us today.
Thank you so much. It was lovely chatting with you.
That is it for me this week. I hope this conversation was as helpful and informative for you as it has been for me. If you enjoyed it, I highly encourage you to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. Of course, keep on tuning into Breaking Points, and as always, thank you so much for your time today.